Hello everyone, this is Peak Entertainment and we are back again, and we're now going to do a special video taking a look at whom I deem to be the most iconic and best movie villains of the 1980s. I've always considered the movie villain to be one of the most important, if not the most important character of the story. It's their motivation, their goal that drives the story forward. It propels the hero or the protagonist of the story, it gives the plot, it compels us as an audience, and overall provides a reason for watching the story progress throughout the movie. That's how it should always work. By having a powerful and imposing villain, it gives the story more importance and therefore makes it a much more of a entertaining and much more of a tense and suspenseful story. How will the hero beat the villain? How will the villain overcome the hero? What lengths will the hero have to go to defeat the villain? Can they do it on their own? Will it take a group of people? Will it come at some cost if you defeat the villain? Is there any way that the villain can be reasoned with or talked down to? Will the victory over the villain come at a cost? This is why I believe the villain of the story is so important. The most iconic villains normally have the most quotable lines, the most memorable scenes. So this is now my breakdown of what I believe to be the most iconic screen villains of the 1980s. I will try and avoid spoilers when I talk about the villains in the certain movies that they are in, but just be forewarned, and I may indeed put a list of these movies in the description so you're warned ahead of time before I go into these choices. So now we're going to start this list, and the first we will have is Ivan Drago from Rocky IV in 1985. Played by Dolph Lundgren, of course. Drago, in many ways, represented the ultimate challenge for Rocky. He was either the irresistible force or the immovable object. He was freakishly powerful, strong, tall, athletic. If you look at the saga prior to this movie, we've seen Rocky initially fail to become champion, then become champion, then lose his title before coming back again. So really, at this stage, Rocky IV was the natural evolution of the character, and in providing Ivan Drago, I think it was the most appropriate choice of opponent, because this meant that Rocky had to be at his absolute peak condition in order to challenge Drago. There's no way that you could have Rocky from the previous movies go against Drago, because Drago is so powerful, he'd defeat Rocky in one punch. That was the thrill of Drago. You know, whether you go into Rocky IV thinking Rocky will win or lose, the thrill of it was how will he beat this 6'5" absolute monster. He's hugely muscular, he's ripped. We go through the scenes and we see him punching, and they're testing his punch resistance, and it's racking up the thousands on the levels. And that's the thrill, as I mentioned before. That's the excitement of having such a powerful and dominating antagonist. Now, people may say, well, he lacks a certain personality, he doesn't really speak a lot of dialogue, but in many ways that adds to the mystique, that adds to the awe of the character. He only speaks when it's absolute necessary. And yes, very much they went for this Terminator cyborg like personality. They clearly did, as if Rocky had to take on now the ultimate machine. Yes, that's clearly the intent, and of course he has the famous scenes throughout, and we see him training in the various montages that the series have become so renowned for. And of course he has without doubt the most iconic quotable lines of the character: if he dies, he dies. And we know that goes on early on within the story. So just a very famous antagonist, and again, by having Ivan Drago as this really bulking, unstoppable force, it makes the story much more compelling, as we see the lengths and the extreme heights that Rocky has to go through in terms of his training and his conditioning in order to face off against the character. And they really do such a good job where we see Drago enter in the ring, and we see the setup, we see the music as he provides his ring entrance. Again, everything is done to provide this image of this truly ultimate machine, this ultimate specimen of a human form that is unbeatable, is unmovable, is untouchable, and that's what Ivan Drago represents. So even though he doesn't have as much of a personality, it's just the sheer weight and force of his presence, and I think you have to credit Dolph Lundgren in that sense. So really a magnificent antagonist and villain for the Rocky series, and without that, one of the most iconic villains of the 1980s. We go on to number 9 in this breakdown, and that is the Predator from the film of the same namesake from 1987. The chameleon-changing alien attacking Arnold Schwarzenegger's platoon in South American jungle is without doubt one of the most coolest looking villains. If you look at all design in terms of his dreadlocks and look at the weaponry and the Predator mask, and he has the skulls of the previous conquests around his neck and around his belt line. The leading motivation behind this character, of course, is that he hunts for sport. So he's not necessarily a world destroying, he's not a world killer. He hunts for the challenge. He hunts in many ways to find the ultimate adversary who can challenge him. And again, that's a fascinating aspect to the character. What made the film, I think, so skillful is that it was able to add certain personality traits to the character, despite the fact that, again, you have very limited dialogue. And once again, that's a fascination to the villain, ranging at around 7 foot tall. He really is an unstoppable beast. And this is again more fascinating, the fact in the weaponry that he has. Again, very stylish and very cool looking. He has this really gritty alien tech. It still looks futuristic, but it's got that really kind of dirt, as if this Predator has been around various planets hunting various types of species. And we see throughout the movie the most special qualities of the Predator, of course, change into the backgrounds that's surrounding him. And I think still very impressive effects even now, particularly if you watch this movie on a Blu-ray, how he emerges into the jungle. It's great effects, it's great suspense that was built up throughout the movie, very escalating and skillful direction from John McTiernan. But the Predator, you know, it's such a fantastic design, such a fantastic looking creature, a fantastic looking alien, and really we needed this after the previous best alien established in the Ridley Scott movies and James Cameron movies. This was really the next best movie monster, I think, of the 1980s. One of the most stylish and definitely the most creative and distinctive action villains of the 1980s. So we go on to number 8 on this list, and that is the Joker. And this is of course from the 1989 Batman movie, directed by Tim Burton, played with high energy and exhilaration by Jack Nicholson. Now, for me, Jack Nicholson, one of the all-time greats, the all-time screen legends of the game, and here I think is without doubt one of his best and most charismatic and outstanding performances. I think what's most distinctive about Jack Nicholson's performance, or his variation of the Joker, is that as well as being dark and twisted and psychotic, he's also very funny, and I think that's what separates him from the more previous versions that we had, both with Heath Ledger's version and Joaquin Phoenix later on, most recently, is that I think the Joker has to be funny. There has to be a sense that there's a kind of comedy, even though it's a dark, twisted comedy, to his whole psychology and the methodology that he uses and all the processes and the different schemes that he comes to. So that's what makes him so unpredictable, because on the one hand you're thinking, well, this character is making me laugh and he's ejecting lots of humour, but at the same time he could be crazy and he could be scary. And I think Jack Nicholson handled these elements the best out of all of the actors that have played the Joker. He was able to successfully give that manic, psychotic energy, but at the same time he was still entertaining to watch. There was more layers, I think, to Jack Nicholson's character, even though he didn't have as quite the complex origin, if you would say, as the Joaquin Phoenix version, but still, Jack Nicholson is a far more entertaining and a far more appealing Joker to watch. And of course he's got magnificent scenes throughout. If we look at the movie in particular, where we first see him coming to terms with his facial scarring, that magnificent scene when the surgeon at the beginning of the movie, when he emerges later on in Carl Grissom, the first line that he has when he emerges as the Joker, as you can see, I'm better already. And then you've got multiple scenes throughout, you know, wait till they get a load of me, where does he get those wonderful toys? So many iconic scenes that you have with Jack Nicholson's version. It really is a standout performance of the movie, and without doubt one of the best comic book villains of any comic book, whether it's the 1980s, the 1990s, or most recently. Without doubt, you know, truly outstanding, and I think one of Jack Nicholson's certainly most vivid and energetic performances, and I love his portrayal, and it's still for me the best version of the character overall. We go on to number 7 on this list, and one of the most infamous and outstanding villains of the 1980s, again providing that sense of the immovable object, the irresistible force, and that is the T-800 Cyberdyne Systems Model 101, the Terminator, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger in James Cameron's science fiction masterpiece. It's still for me Schwarzenegger's most iconic role, and the one that really began his path to superstardom within the 1980s. Yes, of course, he had the likes of Conan the Barbarian a couple of years before this, but it was really this role, this performance as the Terminator, that really brought him mainstream appeal on a global scale. And this is really the ultimate embodiment of the unstoppable killing machine. We all know the original story, where he was initially groomed to play the hero, the Carl Reese character of the storyline, and of course when he met James Cameron over dinner at the time, of course both were really coming into their own in the beginning of the industry. James Cameron was making low budget movies, and he was hoping that Arnie would pick up the bill for the restaurant, and going over the scripts, the genius decision was made, I think it was by Arnie, to say, look, he wants to play the Terminator guy, and it is a masterstroke. I mean, I can't even imagine how much different the movie would have played out if indeed Arnold had turned out to be the Carl Reese character. And there were other speculations, of course, that O.J. Simpson was going to play the Terminator. And just think how different this movie would have been if Arnold wasn't playing the villain in this role. And as the villain, he's everything. Arnold is simply relentless. Again, that idea of the unstoppable killing machine, it creates all the atmosphere and the mood and the suspense throughout the movie. His physical performance is key, because despite having very limited lines of dialogue, I think he has a total of around 16 or 17 lines of dialogue. It's the way Arnold moves and the way he walks and the way he moves as a Terminator. This is more distinctive when we get that iconic scene, of course, when he attacks the police station following the iconic line, "I'll be back," and the way that he's just taking out all the police forces throughout the station, and he's walking through each corridor kind of checking each point, and the way he moves, very machine-like. It's truly iconic to watch. Schwarzenegger really deserves more credit, you know, for a more physical performance as well. It shows, for me, one of the biggest differences is why I prefer the first Terminator as opposed to the second Terminator, where of course now by that time Arnold was really perhaps the biggest superstar within Hollywood. He had firmly established himself as a movie hero, so of course a sequel had to have him as a good Terminator who swears he won't kill anybody and is in touch with his feelings and emotions of other characters, and that never really convinced me as such. You know, to have a good version or a heroic Terminator, you're just taking away so much more of the menace and the intensity. And if you compare that to this performance in the first movie, that's what you have. Real sense of dread whenever Arnold's on screen. You know, you have the great scenes throughout when he walks into the weapon store and he's quoting all of these weaponries, and the guy, like, he doesn't even have half the weaponry, you know, it's just what you see, pal. And you know, that's just great on there, you know, little moments of humor, and again, just a magnificent performance as the Terminator. Truly now one of the best and most iconic movie villains of the 1980s, and a masterstroke again with Arnold Schwarzenegger as the villain, which for me still, despite all the other great movies he's had throughout his career, the most iconic and famous performance of his acting filmography. We go on to number 6 on this list, and that is Hans Gruber from the Die Hard movie of 1988. Alan Rickman's brilliant performance was key to the classic status of the iconic John McTiernan actioner. As Hans Gruber, he is suave, cool, collected, ruthless, in many ways the antidote to the wisecracking, abrasive character of John McClane. And it's that contrast that I think is crucial into how successful this movie is, because I think in many ways, if you had just made Hans Gruber a typical muscular opponent or antagonist, a typical psychotic tough guy, it would have taken away so much of what makes Die Hard so special. Hans Gruber, because of his very polite and intelligent demeanor, you wouldn't really class him as a typical villain. He's very calmly spoken as he's taking on the hostages within the hotel. He is, for the most part, very cool and in command, very methodical, and I think that's in many ways the most threatening type of villain. The villain that has a plan, the villain that has a schedule, the villain that knows what to do, when to do, and is always 2-3 steps ahead of the other characters within the movie. Because as a viewer, you think, well, this is a guy that really is on the ball. He knows what he's doing. Every situation, as the FBI continue the raid in the hotel and is setting the different plans and giving their communications, Hans Gruber is always 1 or 2 steps ahead, and that makes him such a fascinating character. And it's a brilliant performance from Alan Rickman. Unbelievably, this is, I believe, his first big screen debut, which is remarkable, and you think of how brilliant he performs the role. And like I said, the contrast with John McClane is all there to see, and it really does bolster the movie and make it such a special movie overall. I think if you take away Hans Gruber from this movie, it's not the same. This is really, I think, one of the many groundbreaking aspects of Die Hard, is the fact that yes, we were getting a different style and feeling as what we would see in the era of Stallone and Schwarzenegger in their heyday. You know, someone who was smaller in scale but a lot more smart and a lot more intelligent, and that's what made Hans Gruber's performance so special. So that's the reason for me what makes him such an iconic movie villain. Even the way he delivers the yippee-ki-yay line at the end of the movie, he actually delivers it better than what I think John McClane does. So a truly outstanding, classy performance from Alan Rickman as Hans Gruber, and without question one of the most iconic villains of the 1980s. We go on to number 5 on this list, and that is Khan from Star Trek The Wrath of Khan, released in 1982. And for me, without question, the best cinematic villain of all Star Trek movies by some clear distance. And we all know that Khan is very lustful for revenge. Captain Kirk abandoned him and his people. They were abandoned on the planet for so many years. And really, he's very much of that more Shakespearean, classical, tragic villain with that really more sympathetic backstory, if you like. Again, he's not a world killer, he's not looking to take over the universe. In many ways, he has a understandable motivation. He feels that he was wronged and he wants to seek revenge, and that's always a brilliant motivation for any villainous character, when they have a cause that as an audience you can understand, right? If you feel that the villain has been wronged, then whatever lengths they go to seek revenge, you're always gonna, if not maybe sympathise with the villain, you're going to understand where they're coming from, and that makes you more compelled to the character. And it's a masterful performance from Richard Montalban. So many great scenes, so many great monologues from the character. I love the dialogue between him and Kirk when they encounter each other for the first time. The most iconic scene of all. We all know it throughout the internet. There's so many references and memes to it. He's talking to Kirk and he transports over the Genesis weapon, and he talks about being buried alive, and Kirk shouts out Khan in front of the whole planet, and we see Khan really exasperated at this point. It's a masterful scene from, without doubt, the best Star Trek movie within all the series on here. And again, a lot of the reason for that is because you have a brilliant villain in Khan. You know, if you take away Khan, the movie is not as powerful and exciting as what it is, and it's a masterful performance from him. So just a brilliant performance, very memorable and iconic scenes throughout. We go on to the next villain in this breakdown, and without doubt one of the most iconic personalities, iconic performances of the 1980s, and that is Gordon Gekko from Wall Street. Michael Douglas, within this role, the typical corporate CEO, businessman, entrepreneur, the ruthless, cutthroat, single-minded personality, so typical of what we would associate a lot with the 80s, you know, the big businessman, the working class, the white collar personality. And this is really coming towards the height of Michael Douglas in terms of his commercial successes. He already had a string of hits with Romancing the Stone and Jewel of the Nile, and this is really the peak of his career, I think, in many ways, in terms of his acting prowess. He, of course, won the Oscar for this performance, and it was very well deserved. And really, Gordon Gekko is that typical contemporary villainous presence that really a lot of us have come across at some point throughout our working careers, I'm pretty sure of. No, he's not a killer, he's not a murderer, he's not looking to destroy people's lives as such. This is just a very ambitious, super confident, super imposing character. Intelligent, yes, and we see, of course, throughout the movie how he, of course, cuts corners, but he's very determined, he's very hardened, he's very disciplined. So I think in many ways that makes him a less of a cartoonish character and much more of a believable character. Yes, there are moments of sensation throughout the performance, and yes, we have great scenes as well, great speeches throughout. Of course, the most iconic scene that he has, or the iconic speech that he has, the greed is good, we all know that scene throughout, but there still is enough restraint to make him a believable character. You know, we have other great quotable lines: if you want a friend, then get a dog, so will only make 10 million. You know, he's masterful in this role, and yet he's still a great tactician. There's that great scene as well when he comes across Terrence Stamp's character halfway through the movie, and he realizes he's deemed a superior opponent. So after an intense argument, Gekko kind of backs down, and he quotes again the art of war: a battle is won before it's even fought. If you're equally matched with an opponent, you fight him. If he's superior, then you evade him. You know, and just great lines, great quotes like that. It adds credence and credibility to the character. This isn't just a raging monster. This is a guy with a lot of intelligence, but still that ruthless streak. And yet he has, to an extent, likability about him, as we see him bringing up Charlie Sheen's Bud Fox through the ranks. And I think secretly Gordon Gekko looks at Bud Fox as maybe a son that he never had in many ways, and he says he sees the reflection of Bud in his own personality. So again, just fascinating aspects to the character, and for the most part you really like him until we get the kind of third act, which again, without spoiling, when he kind of double crosses Bud Fox late on in the game. But it's just a magnificent performance, and I think Gordon Gekko is a villain that could still resonate today. We did, of course, have the sequel Wall Street Money Never Sleeps back in 2010, but I still think this is a character that you could create and it will still have more relevance in today's culture, today's society that we have right now. So I just think it's a magnificent performance. One of the best, if not still the best performance of Michael Douglas' career. The movie picks up a certain pace and an energy whenever Gordon Gekko's on screen. So truly imposing, truly impressionable, and without doubt one of the most memorable, not only the memorable villains, but also the most memorable characters within all of 1980s movies. So outstanding villain by Gordon Gekko. We go on to the next character on this list, and one of the most iconic within all of comic book movie villains, and that is General Zod from Superman 2 within 1981. One of the all-time great comic book villains, General Zod, along with his companions Ursula and Nog, they want to avenge their imprisonment by Jor-El by killing his son Superman on planet Earth. And Terrence Stamp is terrific in the role, focused, intelligent, smart, vengeful. As I've mentioned already in this breakdown, it's always most compelling when you can at very least understand why the villain is going about what they are. Great scenes throughout, very funny as well, as we see him adjusting to the planet, the people, their ways, their methods, their culture. I love all the little scenes that he has with Sarah Douglas's Ursula as they're commenting on how the humans act and Superman's passion and value towards them. It's just great, and this is, I think, the best way and the best balance of the Superman movies, and really of all comic book movies, because it shows you how you can have a serious villain full of intent, full of purpose, but at the same time you can drop in those little moments of humour, but it's not played as slapstick comedy, which is what I believe the third and fourth movies within this franchise delved into. But General Zod is a fantastic character, just great speeches again. Of course, we have the iconic phrase, the kneel before Zod, in a great sequence where we see the Kryptonians take on the president's forces at the White House. I also love that scene again when he gets the president to send the message out to the world to kind of establish the new world order, and we see Clark and Lois broken down in the bar, and he's watching Zod on the broadcast. And I just love the music, I love the drama as the president calls out for Superman, and Zod again uses that famous line, kneel before Zod. It's just a great performance, and really I think it's a lesson, unfortunately, that the recent iteration of Superman, the cinematic version, just didn't learn from. You know, the fact that yes, you need a serious, intense villain, but you need to have someone with a bit more charisma and a bit more thought and intelligence behind him. And Michael Shannon didn't do a bad job in Man of Steel, but I just felt he was just overcooked. It was too overdone. And I think Terry Stamp's performance is much more composed. It's a much more measured performance. You know, yes, we see moments of rage and intensity, but it's done in a much more sophisticated manner. And I think his General Zod is just a much more believable and a far more compelling character. So a fantastic performance. Still for me the best Superman movie live action that we've seen, and yes, the best Superman cinematic villain that we've seen on screen. A terrific performance from Terrence Stamp and a great performance within this comic book movie, and without doubt, you know, magnificent villain and still the best live action version of General Zod. And so we come now to really the last choice on this list, and if we're thinking about it, the number one on this list, and I'm pretty sure if you talk to any movie fan about who would you regard as the most imposing, the most iconic villain, not only of the 1980s but perhaps all of cinema, I'm pretty sure 90-95% of people would name this choice, and that is of course Darth Vader from the Star Wars movies. Really, I think still the most obvious choice, perhaps the most memorable screen villain of all time. Yes, we've had the prequels showing his origins, but it's really his presence from the original trilogy that where he makes his mark as the most iconic villain, I believe, of the 1980s. And of course, as we're talking about the 80s, we are of course talking about his roles within both The Empire Strikes Back in 1980 and shortly after in Return of the Jedi in 1983. And if we look at his performance within Empire Strikes Back, that is really the ultimate embodiment of what he is as a villain. He, as I explained at the beginning of the video, he is the catalyst and the driving force behind this movie. It is really everything that Darth Vader does, what he's about, what he represents, what he wants to do, that is really the driving force throughout this movie. We see him constantly when he's leading the hunt for the rebellion, when he's giving orders, when he collects later on bounty hunters, giving them instructions, when he's dismissing and later on killing certain general officers who failed to do his bidding. You know, that great quote that he has, apology accepted, as he does the Jedi way of killing the troops on there. It's all fantastic to watch. Capturing Han Solo, his climatic duel with Luke near the end of the movie, you know, this is all within popular culture now. We all know how this movie plays out. He is just really such a powerful and imposing villain and such a fascinating character. And I think if you watch these movies without the prequels, I think it adds more to his awe, and I think his demeanor and his screen presence, everything from his look, his design, his movements, and his voice, of course, by the iconic James L. Jones. Everything is done here to provide what I think is really the most unique and iconic screen villain perhaps we've ever had within all of movies. So many quotable lines, so many memorable scenes, and I think as well, like I said, Empire Strikes Back is when he really is the ultimate boss, the ultimate villain throughout the movie. We then shift later on to Return of the Jedi, where we get more layers and facets to his character. In Return of the Jedi, we get a much more, I think, of a more reflective and redemptive story within Darth Vader, as from the fallout from Empire Strikes Back, where we learn of that Luke is his son, and we get that kind of inner conflict between good and evil within him. He still has the brilliant scenes, of course, but of course with the Emperor in the background, and his story, his journey throughout the movie of Return of the Jedi is a very satisfactory one, and I think overall a very conclusive one, as we see him battling his inner demons and making a reconnection with Luke later on within the story. It's just a brilliant journey and a brilliant character progression. Even if you take away the prequels, I think, you know, this is really the ultimate Darth Vader story, and of course we've seen him appear in many recent iterations of Star Wars. When we look at Rogue One, we look at Clone Wars and Rebels, of course, and to an extent all of those have been very outstanding appearances of the character, but it really is these two movies, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, where we really get Darth Vader, the full force, the full fascinating character, really the most distinguishable and imposing villain for all of 1980s movies, and perhaps still the most imposing screen character, villain character of all time within all movies. So those are my thoughts then, those are my extensive breakdown of the most iconic villains of all 1980s movies. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are there any characters that you feel that I've missed? Do you feel there are certain characters that deserve mention? Are there any other characters within this breakdown that you think I've mentioned that they don't deserve to be in this breakdown, and you think other characters deserve to be as well? Let me know in the comments, and if I agree with you, I may do an individual video concentrating on the villain that you think deserves a place within this breakdown as well. So those are my thoughts on the most iconic movie villains of 1980s cinema. Let me know what you think in the comments below. That's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.